Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. It's my first time in Chile. It's been like a really lovely visit so far with lots of great conversations. I'm sorry that the conversations are still in English rather than in Spanish. So for now we have the translation. I hope this works. I don't know whether people from the back can read it well, but we'll manage to make the language confusion work. And as Ron said, there's kind of a philosophy of science background, both in my training and in my visit here. But at the same time, much of my day-to-day work is not in the philosophy department anymore. It's in a kind of transdisciplinary group. And it aims to address issues that I think are relevant for all scientists. And at the core of the question of how should we do science and what kind of science do we want to do in a world that's so messy, right? That's so messy in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change, but also so messy in terms of social and economic inequality. What is our role as researchers, and what kind of methods as researchers can we use in kind of engaging with that world? And so that's what the talk is about. And so the way I want to set things up is that I first start a little bit with a wider motivation of why would we want to do science differently, right? And then I move on to transdisciplinarity as one potential framework for doing science differently. And then often the idea is that transdisciplinarity kind of promises or allows us kind of a new way of doing research that's more attuned with environmental, social, or whatever problems. And then at the same time, I don't just want to praise transdisciplinarity and talk about how great it is. Having kind of run the transdisciplinary project for the past 6 years, it's difficult, right? And we failed so much. And so a large part of what I think our project and also my current concerns have become about is to kind of think through those failures. Think through why is it so difficult to do science differently. And so then I'm going to conclude a little bit with kind of philosophical reflection at the end. Now, to motivate the whole idea of doing science differently, I want to take you to one of the field sites of our project. So we were doing a workshop on alternative methods in agriculture, more specifically pesticide-free agriculture. And there were very few professors there who were working at the university. Most of the people were students, undergraduate students, in fields like plant sciences, agricultural economics, who were kind of eager to think about alternative futures of kind of agriculture. And then there were a few retired professors. And so one of the retired professors had worked his whole life in making agriculture more productive, right? And he gave this big redemption speech. And so part of that is on the quote where he said, "This dystopia is of our own making. I carry its weight because it is also my creation. But we don't need to destroy our forests. We don't need to poison our soils and rivers. We don't need to exploit each other." And so the idea was that on the one hand, he felt that his own work as a scientist was very complicit in creating exploitation, environmental destruction, right? And on the other hand, he didn't just want to reject science, he was still teaching as a retired professor, as kind of the new generation, but he wanted to teach them how to do science differently, right? And so in agriculture, the motivations are, I think, relatively straightforward for many of us to understand. Agricultural sciences have greatly contributed to increasing food production, and they have had also good effects, right, in reducing global rates of hunger. If you think of what's now known as a green revolution, there have been positive effects. Some of you may know that Norbert Borlaug, the so-called father of the Green Revolution, is the only scientist who's ever received a Nobel Peace Prize for his scientific research. And the justification was that he saved the lives of literally hundreds of millions of people by making food more available for the poor. At the same time, we all know that that's only one side of the story, right? And modern agriculture has made food more cheaply available, but at a very high price. And if you look at the picture, of course, some of the price is very obvious, right? Like the destruction of biodiversity. What happened to all the plants and animals who used to live in this space, right? And of course, it's not only the destruction of biodiversity, it's also the social and economic cost for people, right? The people who used to farm there, they're gone, right? Where are they? Maybe somewhere in the suburbs, maybe working somewhere else, maybe being unemployed. But modern agriculture has been vastly destructive on ecosystems and in social systems, right? And a lot of this has been driven by advancements of science, right? Like plant genetics creating more productive varieties that require heavy application of fertilizers and pesticides that are developed by the chemical industry that allow us to kind of harvest things in a much more efficient way, but for that we need kind of properly engineered big machines, we need to streamline the value chains and so on and so on, right? A lot of that is driven by scientific knowledge, both the positive and the negative effects of it. Now, the idea of doing science differently is, I think, also relatively straightforward in the domain of agriculture, as there are so many counter movements, right? A lot of you will have heard of agroecology, of organic agriculture, of regenerative agriculture. And so part of the project that we've been doing have been working with these kind of movements who want to do farming differently, but that also actively reach out to scientists and figuring out how to kind of incorporate scientific evidence in alternative farming methods. So this photo that you see here in the background is from these events. That's an African Learning Institute, Ali, where we've been working with scientists and farmers in Ghana and West Africa. Now, I've told the story through agriculture, right? But you can tell very similar stories through most fields of modern science and technology. You could think about AI research as a hot topic, right? Obviously, digitalization and the advancement of AI technologies, they can do good for the world, right? But just as in the case of agriculture, if they're primarily used to produce commodities for a few big industry players, they're probably not going to do good for the majority of the people, right? And so a lot of the AI research is just as complicit as a lot of the agricultural research and kind of reproducing realities that are often very exploitative. You could think of health sciences, right? Of the kind of massive industry and the massive amounts of research that are going into producing new products that the health industry can sell to people, right? Rather than creating the types of intervention, the types of knowledge that are necessary to kind of help people most efficiently. And of course, you can think of whatever other domain you may be working on, whether that's engineering or psychology or environmental sciences or whatever. And so a lot of this kind of leads to I think, a relatively straightforward dilemma that I think a lot of scientists face. That on the one hand, their fields are deeply complicit in the exploitation of people and the planet. And then on the other hand, and especially, of course, in times of Trumps and Bolsonaros and so on, we don't just want to be anti-science, right? Science is also indispensable for addressing a lot of these crises, right? And so that dilemma of science being both complicit and being indispensable is something that drives, I think, a lot of scientific movements these days of trying to do science differently, right? Saying, yes, we need science, but we need to do science differently in a way that it properly addresses the problems that people and environments face. And so in many ways, I don't think this is a particularly new diagnosis. I don't know whether I mentioned that, but I'm German originally, and so I grew up in the environment of kind of critical theory and the Frankfurt School, kind of philosophers who kind of try to think about the way how modernity, science, and rationality function, right? And so the kind of founding essay of kind of critical theory, called Traditional and Critical Theory, of this guy, Max Horkheimer, was basically making exactly that point, that modern science may have had an emancipatory function. A few hundred years back, he was writing in the 1930s, but it has become a productive force for the status quo, right? The majority of scientists are working to make administration more efficient, to kind of produce commodities, to kind of keep a system going. And in order for scientists to contribute to a better world, they can't just kind of stick within the structures that they're given, but they need to be able to critically reflect on it. And so that was the idea of critical theory as kind of a way that is not just kind of traditional theory that kind of follows just kind of the methods that it was being taught, but critical theory that can step away and reflect on its own social positioning. And then later on in the 1960s, when some of this kind of overlapped with the student movements, for example, Herbert Marcuse with his one-dimensional man became like one of the kind of founding documents of kind of the student movements of the 1960s, was trying to kind of promise that we could kind of do a different science, what he called new science, right? One that is kind of targeted towards human liberation and emancipation, rather than one that's targeted to kind of reproducing oppression, or that's targeted to kind of just produce commodities. Now, that's all nice and well, but I think one of the problems with critical theory and why I kind of eventually kind of left that type of doing philosophy is it's much easier to proclaim a new science as a philosopher, right, than to actually show how to do it, right? And I mean, I guess that's a bit true for philosophers in general, right? You can kind of make all kinds of great claims, you know, and like, you know, existing science is bad, and we need a new science, and we need a paradigm shift, and blah, 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 and then everything's going to be nice, and because you're a philosopher, you don't have to show how it actually works, right? But so if that's not the kind of philosophy that we want to do, and we actually want to kind of think about, is it feasible? And if so, how is it feasible to do science differently? We need to think more carefully about scientific methods, right? And what would it methodologically mean to do science differently in a way that it actually kind of supports people in their daily lives, that it actually creates a better world rather than just produces new commodities or new technologies of control. Well, that's where the second part comes in, right? So transdisciplinarity is not the only kind of popular buzzword that's being used for people who want to do science differently, but it is one of the most popular ones, right? And so often people assume that that working in a transdisciplinary way kind of gets you out of the old way of doing things, and it allows you to do science differently. Now, to kind of introduce a little bit the term of transdisciplinarity, it's kind of an evolution from the concept of interdisciplinarity. And so interdisciplinarity also has an important role in debates about kind of complex social ecological problems like climate change or social inequality, because a lot of these problems involve so many different factors that you can't just point to one discipline to give you an answer, right? So there's not one discipline that can tell you how to address climate change, right? You need to talk to people who do physical sciences as much as economists, as much as other social scientists, biologists, and so on. So interdisciplinarity means that addressing complex problems requires kind of complex collaborations between scientists from different fields. Now, often that's not enough, because a lot of the things that I presented earlier, for example, agricultural modernization and its exploitative effects, are deeply interdisciplinary, right? They're based on plant geneticists working together with economists, working together with engineers, and so on. But that interdisciplinarity kind of often is constrained by whatever kind of the dominant view of agriculture is within academia. So transdisciplinarity is kind of a step of further broadening the group of people who are involved in knowledge production. So it is not only about different scientific disciplines working together, but it's about scientists working together with people outside of science, right? So in many of these cases, including, for example, agriculture or conservation, it's not enough to just bring scientists together, but we need to also bring other people into the conversation and decision-making, whether it's community elders, extension workers, farmers, fishers, medical practitioners, policymakers, science communicators, social activists, teachers, union workers, and so on and so on. Right? And so transdisciplinarity refers to processes of research and knowledge production that bring people from outside of academia and inside of academia together to do something. Right? And often transdisciplinarity is assumed to allow us to do better science, or maybe to do science differently, along what I call epistemic and political promises. So on the one hand, the idea is that you bring in people from outside of science because they have relevant expertise too, right? So if you, for example, want to develop a strategy for sustainable agriculture in a community somewhere here in Chile, right? And you only send a bunch of scientists from outside to the community and tell the people like how they should farm. There's a very high likelihood that things will go wrong, right? Because the scientists who come from the outside, they don't know so much about the local context, right? And a lot of the farmers, a lot of the people who lived there their whole life, they may have more knowledge about local and environmental factors and microclimates, but they also understand their community better. They have better understanding of what people will want or not, right? They may have a better understanding of what kind of problems could emerge, right? And so transdisciplinarity promises then to kind of create more efficient science in a way, and more efficient interventions by bringing expertise into the conversation that exists outside of academia. Now, at the same time, transdisciplinarity is not just about making things more efficient, right, or more robust. It's also about making things more just and more equal. And so often the idea of transdisciplinary projects is to bring people into the conversation who have been excluded from science, who have been kind of excluded kind of from the hegemonic places of knowledge production, right? So for example, if you have a peasant farming community, a lot of the people there, they never had the opportunity to go to university. They certainly didn't have the opportunities to make academic careers, to kind of shape, kind of put the interests of their community on the agenda for contemporary science, right? So if you include them into a research project, right, you can include their interests, their values, their knowledge, and through that kind of create research processes that are not just kind of more epistemically more efficient by having more forms of expertise, but that are also socially more just by including the kind of concerns and values of people who have been excluded. So that's the overall idea of a lot of transdisciplinary projects. And so, as I said, I've been running kind of a transdisciplinary research team for the past 6-7 years. Our project is called Global Epistemologies, GEOS. And the idea has been that we kind of try to do transdisciplinary projects on the ground, and then we reflect together, and that's the more philosophical part, about the kind of opportunities, but also problems and tensions and contradictions that emerge when trying to do transdisciplinary research. And so what you see in the background are kind of the three communities that we started with. So on the top is kind of our first workshop we did in Salvador, in Bahia, in Brazil. And then on the bottom left is the community in Ghana, in Furikram. And on the bottom right is Oaxaca in Mexico. And since then, like other people with other interests and other geographies have kind of brought in their case studies, right? So you can imagine, for example, if like a PhD from Chile comes to our university and finds that interesting, then we may end up with a Chilean case, right? Now, I'm already seeing that I'm talking for a long time. So I'm not going to talk too much about the cases. But I want to take you at least to kind of one of the places where we've been doing transdisciplinary research. And that place is Bahia. And so in Bahia, it's where a lot of this started. I've been working with Jabal El-Hani, who's a professor for biology at the Federal University of Bahia. And so we've been kind of setting up this project and running this project in two little villages called Ciebinha and Poses for the past 8 years. And so the idea was that we would bring scientists and students together with people in the community to address everyday problems, to address environmental problems, to address social problems, and see how forms of kind of knowledge co-production between scientists and communities can make a positive difference in the community. Right? And so I think just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of how these kind of promises of transdisciplinarity look in practice, I'm just going to walk you through a few of the cases of what we've done there. So part of it has been to document the expertise of the fishers in the villages and to take them seriously as experts in their own right? So the idea that it's not just the academically trained ecologists who are experts on the ecosystem there, which is a mangrove forest, but that it's also the fishers. And so we studied quite a few phenomena that the fishers were very knowledgeable about, but the scientists did not understand. And so one of the phenomena kind of we represented in this flowchart, I think it's a bit too small to read, but so the phenomenon is called the robalo waters in the community. Robalo is a type of fish. And at certain points, a lot of these fish appear, and the fishers go out and catch them. Right? And so none of the scientists knew how to explain that phenomenon, why all of a sudden, you can catch a lot of these fish. And so we did interviews with the fishers, and they provided us with a very complex explanation. It has to do in part with rain that's happening further upstream at the river, and then the rain comes down the river, and in part it displaces the fish from where they're hiding, so they come out of their hiding, right? And that's when you can catch them. In part it's because all the kind of new water that comes in, it muddies the water, right? The water becomes brown, and so the fish can't see the fishing nets anymore, right? But then there are other factors, as I explained. For example, there's a phenomenon in the mangrove forest that's called the burning waters. So that's bioluminescence. So kind of the whole water kind of lights up. It's like magical movie type of scene. And so that's caused by some bioluminescent jellyfish, as I explained. But what also happens is when this phenomenon occurs of burning waters, then the bioluminescence gets caught in the nets, and then the nets light up, and the fish can see the nets again, right? So they don't. So that's why there can't be these robalo waters when there's bioluminescence. But then they explain this can be overridden by a full moon, because a full moon has such a bright light that then it kind of overrides the bioluminescence, and so on and so on. So it's a very complex explanation, right? And it's an explanation that the fishers were giving us, right? That they knew, but none of the scientists knew, right? And so that's kind of a starting point in terms of epistemic reconstruction of taking people outside of science seriously as experts, right? Of course they don't know everything. There are a lot of things that scientists know that the people in the community don't know, right? But it's also often the other way around, right? And then the idea was that on the basis of this kind of mutual recognition of expertise, we can do things together that will be beneficial for the community. And so in part, that related to us kind of getting involved in policy domains. So here's one of the examples of it. In Brazil, there's a period that's called the defeso. And the defeso is the period when the fishers are not allowed to fish because the fish lay their eggs, right? And so you want to protect the fish during their reproductive period in order to kind of make sure that they reproduce, and then the fishers are allowed to fish only in the other times of the year. Now the defeso period is federally set from Brasilia, right? And the fishers were very frustrated with it because they were telling us, that's not when the fish lay their eggs, right? And so that's what you kind of see on the well, again, it's probably too small, but the red parts are the parts when the fishers are not allowed to fish. And then the bars show the periods when the fishers actually told us that they find fish with eggs, right? And as you see, they're either not correlated or they're negatively correlated, right? And so clearly, by not taking the local expertise seriously of when you can find fish that lay the eggs, the Brazilian government set the wrong periods for protecting those fish, right? And so a transdisciplinary way of recognizing different forms of expertise and bringing that into kind of co-produced policymaking would allow us to kind of come up with fishery policy that is epistemically more just by recognizing the people, environmentally better by protecting the fish better, and better for the communities and kind of securing the basis of their livelihood, which is fishing. Right? One more example. Another part where a lot of the project got involved was in education. Right? And so one of the areas where of course legacy of traditional disciplinary top-down science is very visible is science education. Right? So people in the communities, when they kind of got biology textbooks, right? They got the textbooks that were, again, produced in Brasilia or Sao Paulo or something like that, was kind of the standard examples of biology education, you know, Darwin and Lamarck and the giraffe, and none of the kids had ever seen a giraffe in their life, right? And so it neither made a lot of sense, right, for the kids there, nor did it really speak to the type of knowledge that matters for them, right? And so we produced these kind of educational comics together with the teachers and the kids that present side by side the kind of the knowledge of academic ecology, right, about things like ecosystem dynamics, as well as the knowledge of the fishers about the ecosystem, right, and started to kind of teach both of them as a part of biology education. Right? So I hope that gives you a little bit of a better idea of what transdisciplinarity can mean in practice, right? It's not just an abstract promise of doing science differently, right? But it can be embedded in very concrete practices of how you kind of do education, how you do policy, like who you kind of consult as an expert, right? And so that you can kind of create a more inclusive community of knowers that can make a difference in a way that actually matters, for example, for a small fishing village like Sibinia. Now, that's all great, but there's something else about thinking through our failures. So this is us again, the team at our last big event in Salvador, which was great, and I think we learned a lot, and I think we had a lot of good successes, and some of the examples that I showed you, like I think we were all very proud of, right? At the same time, I think over the years, a lot of our kind of more research attention shifted to the question of why is it so hard, right? Why is it so difficult to get these things actually done in practice, right? And you have all these scientists, including, I guess, many of you who come to a presentation like this, right? Who love science, they want to do good in the world with their science, right? But it's so difficult as scientists, right, to kind of make a difference in a positive way. Right? And so part of what we started to discuss is what we started to call the one happy family fallacy. Right? So a lot of, I think, transdisciplinary and also more generally diversity-oriented work in science kind of presents this narrative of, well, we're including everyone. It doesn't matter what gender or class or race you are, right? And we're all working together in making the world a better place. And of course, that's the diversity that you see on corporate brochures, right? You know, people of all skin colors and genders smiling together, creating something great together, right? And the reality of transdisciplinarity is you bring people together with very different backgrounds, whether it's class, gender, race, whatever, right? Very different cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, different agendas. No, it's not a happy family. You know, people talk past each other, they misunderstand each other, they have conflicts with each other, they have different interests. It's a mess, right? And so transdisciplinarity, the more inclusive it tries to be, the more mess it creates, right? And so the reality is, first of all, it's full of what we call epistemological conflicts, right? So think of the examples that I gave you earlier. You know, you have an ecologist who works with kind of mathematical models of ecosystem dynamics, right? You have a fisher in a traditional community who works on the basis of evidence from everyday fishing, kind of the tales that their parents and grandparents told them, right? They may be both experts, but they have such different understanding of what evidence is, how evidential reasoning works, that it's not so straightforward to just add up different types of knowledge and you kind of create something better, right? Then there are parts of ontological conflicts where people have often very different ways of relating to nature, very different ways of understanding nature in the first place, right? So that's especially striking, of course, in the parts of our work or other transdisciplinary work that tries to bring scientists and indigenous communities together, right? Because for a lot of indigenous communities, a forest is not a natural resource, it's an ancestor, right? It's the ways of relating to other beings is often radically different from the ways how scientifically trained researchers do that, right? And it's not obvious that you can just kind of squish them together and all of a sudden they produce something great together. And then maybe the most obvious thing is you'll have all kinds of political conflicts, right? It's great to say, hey, let's include everyone, and everyone kind of works together. But if you think of my earlier example of kind of agricultural modernization, if you bring some peasant and indigenous farmers together with kind of big agri-food companies and they're supposed to work together and create a better world, that's obviously kind of naive given the fact that they have radically different agendas of what they want to do with the land, right? So the reality of transdisciplinarity is that it's a field of challenges in which more political questions of different positions of power of transdisciplinary actors, institutional pressures, interpersonal skills, and so on, make it incredibly difficult to make a difference. Now, I'm going to speed up a little bit. One part of the story is to kind of curb the enthusiasm about transdisciplinarity as kind of the way of doing science differently and creating a better world, right? Transdisciplinarity is great, and I wrote a whole book on it, and I do transdisciplinary projects, but it's not kind of a magical bullet for doing science differently. And I think there are two parts of that. One is the way academia is structured, right, is often deeply hostile to doing these types of transdisciplinary projects in all kinds of ways. But most obviously in terms of kind of the academic incentives versus the incentives of doing kind of serious transdisciplinarity. So for a lot of our PhD students, for example, right, on the one hand, they were all very motivated. Most of them came from Bahia. They wanted to do science, do something good in their community, right? They wanted to do a difference. On the other hand, in order to get their PhD from Wageningen, my university, they needed 4 peer-reviewed papers, right, and articles. They had funding for 6 months of field work, right? And they had to think about the academic careers afterwards. They need to kind of frame things in a way that was recognizable as serious research in their subfield, right? And if you hang out with a community and you build a new school or whatever, that's not a paper, right? And that's not an original research insight, right? And of course, similar dynamics happen at like broader institutional levels, right? A lot of this stuff requires long-term commitment of collaborating between scientists and communities, right? That's why in Slovenia we've been there for almost 10 years now, and we're still far from fully there, you know, but good luck finding a funder who gives you 10 years to work with a community, right? So a lot of this just doesn't match the reality of how the science system is set up. And then second of all, even when transdisciplinarity becomes incorporated into universities, it often happens in very superficial ways, right? And I think that happens particularly in cases where you have some broader diversity management agendas, right? Where diversity is kind of used to legitimize an organization. Like, you know, look, we have a black CEO. Look, we have a woman as a university president. Doesn't mean that the university or the company starts operating differently, right? Sometimes diversity is used in a way to legitimize the status quo, right? And that's something that I see a lot with transdisciplinarity. It kind of looks nice and it's cute, and look, you bring in the communities, and look at those indigenous people, we can put that on some poster, right? But it doesn't change how the institutions operate, right? And so that's like the book, like Olufemi Taiwo wrote this, a political philosopher wrote this book called Elite Capture that is not about transdisciplinarity but identity politics, but I think it describes those dynamics quite well. Okay, enough negativity. I'm going to wrap up with some more positive notes. So transdisciplinarity is not kind of a magic bullet, right, for doing science differently. At the same time, I do think that transdisciplinary projects often are very efficient in challenging established norms of how science should operate, right? Creating new ways, for example, of collaborating, including new voices, new ideas of people who have been excluded, right? And even if in our collaborations, for example, with the fishing communities of Srbija and Países, we clearly didn't achieve complete equality, right? But we achieved better conversations. We achieved conversations where people did trust each other. They did learn from each other, right? They did listen to each other. And we started doing things differently through that, right? And so in that sense, I do think that a lot of transdisciplinarity, it's not a magic bullet, but it reflects a wider shift in the science system of people who are looking for ways of experimenting with different scientific methods, right? That include different people, different concerns, and create different types of outcomes, right? And so, in that sense, I do think we should continue doing transdisciplinary research, and I do think that people in my own field of philosophy should also work transdisciplinarily. And this is just going to be 2 or 3 minutes. I'm almost done. But so the idea is also, I think for philosophers, the idea of working together with people rather than just talking about people can be scary, right? Because a lot of philosophers, they're comfortable with their books and kind of looking from the outside, right? They don't have very good social skills. And so this whole idea of a philosopher kind of being in all of this mess and having to kind of work together with like all kinds of different people, it's scary, right? But I do think that philosophers can actually contribute quite a bit to that. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in the book as well is to distinguish between philosophy of transdisciplinarity, right? As philosophers, we can think about all these kind of transdisciplinary movements in science, and we can theorize, or we can ask how explanations work in transdisciplinary science or whatever. But the idea is not to do a philosophy of transdisciplinarity, but to do philosophy in a transdisciplinary way, right? So for philosophers to become part of these communities, right? And for them to contribute to these transdisciplinary communities. And I do think that's something where actually a lot of philosophers have a lot of useful things to contribute. Because as one of the main takeaways I hope from this talk is it's complex, it's messy, right? It's different knowledge systems, it's different worldviews, it's different values. And that's one of the skills that philosophers have, is to kind of think through the complexity of knowledge, of values, of concepts, and so on, right? So I think we can actually contribute in some ways in navigating this. And so I'm done with that. We wrote a whole book on this, and it's open access, so with a QR code you can just download the PDF if you want. Thank you.